Hello everyone, welcome back to Planet Coaster 2 and welcome back to Utopia World. If you remember in the last episode we built this facade, a Western themes facade with the new Western pieces, and in today's episode we're going to get into the dark ride. So obviously there's going to be a huge show building with a dark ride inside it, and the dark ride I selected was the one with the constantly moving vehicles, which kind of turned out not to be the best choice really for a dark ride, especially a more old-fashioned dark ride like the one we're building here. The idea for this ride is that it's going to be kind of janky and very low budget, something that a low budget park would realistically have, and that also helped me put it together a lot quicker than if I was doing a highly immersive dark ride. So to put that in perspective, it probably took me about 2 or 3 hours to complete the dark ride, as opposed to around a year like an immersive one with highly detailed theming would normally take me to do. Not saying I'm the best at building dark rides, but for this one I think it worked out pretty well. It was really easy to build, and I just tried to make things as simple for myself as possible. So you can see that I'm laying out the sort of foundations for the building and the different rooms of the ride. And keeping everything on one level like this also makes things a lot more straightforward, rather than if you're doing a coaster or something like that with different levels. So we box everything in using some very plain wooden walls. And then I start working. The first thing I work on is the queue line actually for the ride. The idea was to just have the queue going to the entrance building, but that turned out not to really work out because guests were getting stuck. So right near the end of the episode I changed this idea, and in the end had the queue run along the front of the show building as well, and that seemed to solve the problem. Still having a few issues with guest flow and stuff like that in this park at the moment, but I think it's nothing too different to how it was in Planet Coaster 1, to be honest. So for the queue line itself, very basic, just some wooden pillars and some fencing, and then a few sort of detail pieces like some crates and some very basic sort of low budget theming elements. It still turns out looking fairly nice and heavily themed. Well, not heavily themed, but themed in all areas. But the idea is that we're just using theming that would be cheap and easy to make, and you'll see more of that once I start working on the actual ride itself. At the moment, just filling in all the details, or rather all the walls and everything like that for this queue line area. And sometimes it's quite difficult to make sure you're covering up the right pieces and sort of hiding away the show building elements. So we've got the plain grey walls and stuff behind. You won't see any of that from guest perspective once this is complete. So yeah, pretty straightforward really with the theming here, using some wall decals as well to make sure that there's a little bit of detail and it's not just completely plain walls everywhere, because I don't really like to see that in a build. I find it a little bit lazy, so just adding that tiny little bit of detail to make it a little bit more interesting. And now you can see the crates and stuff like that going in. It's nice that we've got these new crates in the Western set as well. I think they work really well. And using some rope pieces as well. Also looking at doing some lighting here. Again, copying and pasting some of the lights that were on the front of the show building, because they work absolutely fine. We've got a few more lamps in the game now with the Western theme, which is really useful. I felt we were quite lacking in lighting before, so that's another thing that this sort of brought to the table, which is really good. And with that is the queue line part of the ride pretty much complete. So I start covering it all up, and then we get to sort of see it with all the ray tracing glory and the dark lighting that we now have in the game, which obviously looks really good. and it makes it really easy to build. sort of dark ride sections. Obviously something that we couldn't do in the first game without turning it to night mode or covering up in a big mound of terrain or something like that. So yeah, once the queue line's complete, I believe the next thing I do is the station. I'm trying to remember what sort of order I do it in. Looking at some of the exit path there actually, and again placing some of the same sort of props in. And yeah, just really really straightforward stuff, and some wall decals once again as well. Copying over these same pillars, which are really simple but effective. I think, you know, they can work well for a Western theme anywhere you put them really. And they're especially good for interiors, just to make sure everything doesn't look too plain. I even went a little bit further with the exit queue here. You can see we've got a room as well, which will become a gift shop. I'm not sure how common that would realistically be back in the day with a more old-fashioned dark ride. I think that's probably a newer thing that parks tend to do, especially if they've got rides with IPs and stuff like that, because they can sell all the merch. But I thought we're going to do it anyway. It makes sense. We've got plenty of room, and the facade runs all the way along, so we've got the space there to put a gift shop in. So we might as well capitalise on some of that guests' money when they come off the ride. And then finally covering up all this area again with a wooden piece that's not from the Western set. Actually, I can't remember what that's from, but it's base game anyway. And yeah, it's pretty good. Now moving on to the station then, and didn't really do too much with this, to be honest, just placing down some floor pieces, just some random wood textures that we've got, or wood pieces rather that we've got. And I did play around with the idea of recolouring one or two of them, but I didn't really like how it looked, to be honest, so I ended up scrapping that idea and just changing them back to all be pretty standard, all the same colour. And then had a bit of a struggle with the floor texture for part of the station, because there just wasn't enough room basically to put them in, so I used a different piece in the end. And then quickly skipping to theming up the ride vehicles, and that was a pretty basic job really. I didn't know what to do too much, didn't want to go overboard obviously, but the vehicles themselves looked a little bit too modern without any theming on them, so I thought we'll just chuck a few pieces on, and I think they look a lot better like that. But like I say, the actual choice of ride here probably wasn't the best, but we'll get more onto that and the reasoning behind it later on. Obviously it's not going to change at this point because it's all in place. And now the fun part starts, where I start building the actual dark ride itself, and this first scene is going to be a small western town, and we've got a sort of cowboy animatronic jumping down when a door opens and there's an explosion, and the cowboy jumps down. Unfortunately, it still has the base on it, so you can see the base jumping with the cowboy, which isn't ideal. But again, I think it sort of adds a little bit to the idea that this is a really janky dark ride and really low budget. And it's kind of fun to do that sometimes, rather than having to make something that looks really good. You can make it look kind of naff and say, well, they had a low budget, but at the same time you're putting a lot of effort into it still. But, you know, it's designed to sort of replicate a certain style of ride, I guess. Another thing that I've done here really is sort of shrinking down the doors and windows and the actual wall pieces themselves, so that we've got almost like a miniature town, and they are just sort of set pieces, so there's no back to these. I support them with some support pieces, which you'll see in a bit as part of the realism, but now you can see what I'm doing with the cowboy animatronic here, which was an absolute pain in the arse, to be honest, to get working. I connected two moving platforms together, and I'm still not the best at using the moving platforms, to be honest. It's still a work in progress for me. One day I want to do some really good theming using them to their full potential, but I still think there's a couple more options that we need, like the potential to make them move and then stop for a set period of time, or move to one end and stop there. Without being able to do that, I feel like we are fairly limited. There is a sort of trick where you can simulate that by stacking a load of them up together, but I couldn't quite get my head around it for this build, so I kept everything janky and sort of, it works, so it's fine. And sometimes you can use the sort of triggered effects like the fire and the fog and the explosion that we've got here in order to hide the bits you don't want to see, and again trying to hide a little bit of it with rocks. It still looks pretty terrible when you're on the ride, but I don't know if it's sort of an unbelievable animatronic. It's the sort of thing that would probably be done. You see it sort of come down, and then if you're looking at the corner of your eye, you might see it go back up, which you shouldn't be seeing. But that's sort of how it is. And yeah, so continuing on with the western town here, and putting a couple more buildings in, all just for show really here. And again, all front facades, not proper buildings. They're basically like set pieces, like you'd see in a movie, which I think is a really fun idea. Actually, it's a different way of building, and it's a really quick and easy way of building as well. So you can see now that I'm going to start doing the support structures behind, and I had to find the right pieces for these. The pre-made ones were a little bit too big, so I ended up making something a bit more custom. And I'll probably spend more time working on, or I'll probably put more effort into the support structures that you're never really going to see than I did the actual theming itself. But I think, yeah, it was really fun to add that sort of level of realism into the build. And it's probably a bit overkill as well. You probably wouldn't need a structure quite this big to support a set piece of this size, but I don't know. I'm not really that clued up about that sort of thing. I bring in probably the most expensive piece of theming that this ride will have as well, which is a water tower. And the fact that that's now recolorable and rescalable makes it really good to work with, and it fits perfectly into this little scene. Then just sort of moving the wall back a bit so the supports don't clip through it. And you can see now the western towns are really starting to come together. Put another cowboy in, and a triggered effect there that makes it look like he's shooting. As of the... oh, looks like we had a crash there. As of the latest update from Frontier, we are apparently going to get the animatronics with the guns at some point. Hopefully in the next update, so that will be really, really handy. I can probably go in and switch a few of these up once we get those in. So at the moment we've only got the animatronics that are just sort of standing around. We've got this one crouching down, which is the one I use for the animatronic here. And yeah, other than that, in this section it's just putting a couple more building fronts on and finishing off with the theming. This is probably the most detailed section of the ride, to be honest. The rest of it, the rest of the scenes probably aren't as good as this, I'd say. But there's quite a lot of ambience in the ride and stuff, so I still think it would be a fun ride, and I'd like to think that it would be considered a classic if something like this were to be made. Obviously they don't really make rides like this anymore. They'd spend a little bit more money and do a slightly nicer themed experience these days. For the realism again here, we're adding an exit door, which you obviously see on these rides quite a bit. You have to have sort of fire exit, I guess, for safety purposes. and that's what we've done here. So you can see it in the corner, but it shouldn't be too visible from the ride. But I'm sort of not bothered if it is a bit visible, because I think it adds to the realism. And also adding in these supports at the top for the lighting. I can't remember what you would call these in real life, but they're sort of like what you use for stage lighting and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely on the more realistic front. I did put some lights up here, but I think that the spotlights I used there were just for show, because I'd already lit the area before I thought of doing that. So yeah, they're just in there for show, really. And then finally a couple more buildings at the start of the ride, because there was a little bit of a gap between the station and the first scene, and I wanted to sort of fill that in. So again, doing very, very basic facades with hardly any theming, but they work out perfectly for what we're going for. I had to move them forward a bit as well, because there wasn't enough room for the actual supports, or sort of trying to cover up some of the supports there and sink them into the wall and stuff. And then at this point I could just cover up the rest of the building itself and know that this bit was complete, which was quite satisfying, really. Being able to just corner off a section saying, yep, that's done. So you can see that I've also added an outer wall as well, for the only purpose that we will go back and add a proper backstage area at some point. So the whole area around the back and side of this building will be backstage. But obviously we've got the train line running just around there, so we're going to have to look at some point a way to sort of cover that up. Maybe some go away green fencing or something like that, or even just a bit of foliage should do the job. Now, unfortunately, I lost a load of footage. Well, I didn't lose a load of footage, I just didn't hit record when I thought I did. So the sort of second scene in the ride, you're not going to see really me build. There's nothing too spectacular, really, mainly just rock work and a couple of explosions and stuff like that. So this is pretty much the final big scene of the ride before it goes back round to the station. And I decided to build a bit of a ditch and some train track and rocks and stuff like that. No idea why, really. It's pretty pointless building the ditch as well, because you're not really going to see it in the dark on the ride. But I think the train track looks pretty cool, and we've got this big cowboy shootout at the end with some of them on the train and some of them just standing on some rocks basically on the tracks. And yeah, again, this train piece is probably quite expensive for them to build, but I felt like it's okay to put one big prop in there like that. And yeah, that's it then for that scene, pretty much. As for the story of this dark ride, it's kind of just really, really basic. It's just some local cowboys start a gunfight, basically, or some things start going on in their local town, and they run out into the desert and start fighting. And yeah, at the end it's just a showdown between two different groups of cowboys. So that is pretty much the storyline for this one. But I think it works. I think it's fine. I don't think we need to add too much more to it for it to be a believable enough dark ride. So just doing a little bit more lighting and some realism bits just to polish things off, making sure that we've got exits in places where you would actually be able to get out of the building in case of a fire. And then we get to cover the entire thing up and sort of call this dark ride complete, which is really cool that I managed to do it in such a short space of time. I had some sort of feeling that it might become 2 videos, which I didn't really want to happen. So being able to do it all in one go was pretty good. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with the final product of this one. But that's not the build over. Obviously, we still have some of the facade to work on and the area around the ride, and I wanted to make sure that all this was complete before I put out another video, so that we could sort of corner off this area and say that it's pretty much done, bar all the backstage stuff. So I decided I would do the shop interior, which was really fun to do. Actually, I quite like doing things like this, and again, it was more basic and low budget, so we just basically went onto the workshop and found some cool gift shop pieces, which I had to scroll through quite a bit until I found some, but I found this really cool one by Tenpilots, so I'm going to link that in the description if you want to download it yourself. And then just recoloured some of the t-shirts and hoodies and stuff, which they're really cool. Looks like they were made from the sort of fabric pieces that we've got in the game. And then we've got the Planet Coaster 2 board games and mugs over here, and a shelf of other things. I can't remember what was on these, some plushies I think, and yeah, just recolouring the shelves and stuff to make them fit in, but other than that, just using them sort of as they were, because they're really good sets. And there's some barrels as well I put near the door. Probably could have filled it out a little bit more, put a bit more in there, but it was quite a small shop, and I feel like we've got enough really to call it a day with this one. And then doing the till. So I've got a cash desk, cash register of the workshop as well, which again I'll link in the description. Popped a couple of them in, and then it's just a case of finishing off the details in the shop. I decided to have a little bit of light coming in to this stage, so now you come up the dark ride and there's a little bit of light glaring in, so you can actually see a little bit better in the shop without it all just being lighting. And hung a couple of the decorations on the wall as well, and definitely remember these from the first game. They're a really good piece, but they are now recolorable as well, so that's always a bonus. And then just the lighting and putting the roof on, and I ended up just having the ceiling here as a dark ride section, because ceiling isn't something you're going to be really focused on, so I thought it was fine to just continue that. I didn't really mention the ceiling actually much for the dark ride, but basically it was just the normal roof piece that I'm using everywhere, with a basic shape coloured black underneath it. So we've got two layers there. I have layered everything up a little bit too much maybe on this dark ride, used more pieces than I probably needed to use, but it just sort of felt like the right thing to do, I guess. And now finally moving on to finishing off the facades for this area, which are just a continuation really of what we've already got. This isn't really a focal point, so I didn't want these ones to be particularly detailed. So again, just sinking windows into the wall pieces, and I tried to do this cool thing with the triangle window, but it didn't quite work. So in the end, I just made my own triangle section on the top, using bracket pieces, which was quite a good idea, I thought. And from a distance it looks reasonable. If you zoom right in, it looks a little bit janky, but it's yeah, it's fine. Again, I think this is a believable level of theming for a park of this budget, to the extent that, you know, it's a Western, it's probably quite cheap to do. It doesn't need huge amounts of detail or huge amounts of expensive pieces. A lot of it's just plain wood or painted material that's painted to look like wood, I guess. And that's the thing with theme parks, you never know what's actually real and what's not, because a lot of things are just sort of false to look like they're supposed to replicate what they are, if that makes sense. And then just finishing off with some pillars on this one, and trim pieces and whatnot. And yeah, after that, I think that leaves us with one more building, I want to say. I think I make that final section into all one building, but one that's kind of quite different to all the other buildings. I had to work out what to do with the slight gap in the wall there as well, but we figured something out there, and I don't think it's really too much of a problem. Also, working on this area, I had to be very careful not for anything to clip through to the shop or the exit queue that are just behind it inside. I did fortunately give myself quite a bit of clearance, so it wasn't really too much of a problem there. And you can see now I'm using the sort of vertically slabbed wooden walls instead of the horizontal ones, and just sinking some different windows in for a complete bit of variation and some really good colour variation with this building as well. And yeah, I'm actually quite pleased with how this one turned out. I thought it was a nice sort of addition to the western facade here, and a nice sort of way to round off this whole section of facades. Again, using the idea of just making one piece and copying it over, which is something that's always been really a really good building technique to do in the Planet games, because it saves you building the same thing over and over again, and then just looking inside there to make sure that nothing's clipped through, which I think it had a little bit, and we managed to sort that out. I wanted this building to have sort of overhanging roof sections all the way around, but then I really struggled here with working out how to do the corners, because we do have corner pieces, but because these aren't completely straight, it was kind of difficult to actually get them in, so I sort of bodged it a bit. But again, from distance you're not going to notice, and it looks good enough to work out for what we want it to. And yeah, I think that's I think I spent probably a little bit too much time worrying about that. Found these really cool bracket pieces as well that I used to support the overhanging roof. I'm quite pleased with how they turned out. And then some pillars again, all the usual stuff, but I didn't want them going all the way, I just wanted them on the lower floor of the building, because I thought we'd use pillars too much everywhere else, and I didn't want to. I just didn't feel like they worked with the aesthetic of this building. So yeah, that's what I did pretty much. And as we sort of come to the end of another mammoth episode of Utopia World, I sort of feel like the western area is now nearly complete for the park, which is really cool. There's still more that I want to do. I want to go back over the areas that I've already built and probably add a little bit more of the western theming stuff to them. So that's something that I'll look at doing at some point. And I also want to build some midway games. I think I've mentioned this several times before already, but I think like a gunslinger type thing would be kind of cool. So we just need to find a good spot for all them. I did in the last episode cut down the path a fair amount because we had a really, really wide open plaza and it was just too big. So I ended up downsizing all of that, and it works out quite a bit better now that that's done. But yeah, for the rest of this build, really, we're just looking at finishing off with some details and stuff around the path and everything like that. So I think I'll leave you to enjoy the time lapse for the rest of the build, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Thank you for watching.